Well, good morning. I'm Jim Englert, and this is Jim Sutherland and Bill Schubert. And the three of us are participating in another of the Heritage Series of Children's Hospital. The Heritage Series has as its purpose preserving a historical perspective on the hospital and the people who inhabited the hospital over the years. In the past, most of the subjects have been more or less academically oriented. People like Ashley Weech and Joe Warkany and Al Sabin. Bill Gerhardt, who's the historian extraordinaire of Children's Hospital, thought it would be interesting to look at this from the point of view of the residency days at Children's Hospital, and then perhaps from the point of view of what it was like to practice pediatrics in that time. And so you might then call our hour upon the stage here the making of a pediatrician in the 1950s. It was a good time, the 1950s. It was a post-World War II era. We were all still carrying the aura of victory in a just war, and, which affected our psyches, I think, and it produced a kind of an attitude of you can do anything, and it changed. I think it changed the kind of people who were going into medicine. There were with the help of the GI Bill, there were large numbers of returning veterans in their 20s and 30s, and even some in their 40s, most married, and many with children who came back, went to medical school, and became physicians. And a lucky few of them wound up at Children's Hospital. The three of us wound up there. We were all there together in the early 50s. And it was a time of fond memory. And if you find us wallowing around in the past and nostalgia, you'll have to forgive us. At any rate, just so that you know where we're coming from, I'd like maybe each one of us to give a brief biography of what we were doing before we came to Children's Hospital. Jim, would you start off with that?
Well, I grew up in Chicago and went to the University of Chicago. And in the midst of my course, I went off to war in the Air Force. Was a navigator on a B-17 flying out of England over Europe in the last 6 months of the war. Got out soon after that, finished my pre-medical course in a year or so, entered medical school in 1946, graduated in 1950. I was looking for an internship, and the dean of the University of Chicago Clinics was Dr. Bachmeier. Dr. Bachmeier had been administrator of the General Hospital. As a matter of fact, he had an apartment which was up on the second floor of the General Hospital. And he was one of my advisors in choosing an internship, and he said I should come to Cincinnati. My classmates all said I was going east to intern. I had a marvelous internship. We had to make up our minds about what we were going to do subsequently pretty quickly. And I chose pediatrics, which I had very much enjoyed as a medical student. I had a wonderful experience during the internship, and particularly on pediatrics. There were some marvelous teachers, two of them, Katie Dodd and Ken Rogers, who was a resident, directed me, I think, really toward neonatology or toward the newborn. They were exciting teachers in the nursery. And so then I continued my residency. And I said sort of offhand once to Dr. Weech that I thought I'd like to go into the field of the newborn. newborn research, and he was very helpful and encouraged me to go on and get training with Clem Smith. And then after that offered me a job back in Cincinnati, so that's where I came from briefly.
I can't imagine you in this B-17 flying over the English Channel. You weren't in that nose cone, you're looking out. You were not a bombardier.
No, I was a navigator. I was in the nose, yes, I was in the nose with the bombardier. I had a little desk behind him.
No wonder you were able to survive Schubert. Bill, how about yourself?
Well, I'm Cincinnati. I grew up in Cincinnati. Was born in Clifton, lived in Pleasant Ridge, and went to Walnut Hills High School. Went to the University of Cincinnati. And that was in, I guess I graduated in 1944 from high school, started UC, and after about 6 months was drafted. At that time, the football team was so decrepit of men that they asked me to play on the football team. That's as close as I got to varsity football in my life. So I was, anyway, drafted, and we came right toward the end of the war, and I went into the Navy. Trained at Navy Pier for boot camp, was put into an electronic technician's mate and training, which is repair of radar and sonar and radio. And it was a school. It was one of the best schools I've been to. I went through that school for the next almost 2 years until VJ Day. When the bomb was dropped, why, we were all exuberant in Chicago at that time, because our training was in Chicago and Detroit and Navy Pier. The thing that I remember the most was in that school was the classes were every day from 8 to 5, and then from 6:30 or 7 till about 11. And there was a test once a week, and the impetus to study was the living pictures of tankers that had been shot down and were sinking over the North Atlantic. And the impetus to study was that if you didn't pass, you were going to be on one of those tankers the next week. So we studied very hard. And so graduating from there, came back to Cincinnati. Went to UC for pre-med, went to medical school and was married when I went to medical school in 1948. Went through medical school from 48 to 52, and had one child when I came out in 52. Dr. Vilter was my advisor here at UC. He had me programmed to go into internal medicine in Boston. I thought about that for a while, decided that after my pediatric rotation at Children's that I'd rather go into pediatrics. Dr. Vilter never forgave me, but he and I still talk about that. At any rate, I went into a pediatric residency at Children's. After diverting myself 1 year to Riley Hospital in Indianapolis, came back and started my residency. That was a rotating or mixed residency also, like the one here at General. Came back and started pediatric training under Jim Sutherland, who was our chief resident at that time. We had many outstanding teachers also, and at any rate, I finished by that time, Katie Dodd had left. She was our teacher in pediatrics in the third and fourth year, but she left in our fourth year to go to Arkansas. We finished my pediatric residency, took 1 year, started a hematology fellowship with Gene Leahy, who had come from Salt Lake City, where he trained with Max Wintrobe. After 1 year of the fellowship, Gene said that he was going to go back to Salt Lake. I had 2 kids by that time and no money, and my father said no more. So I said I'd stay here. So I ended up doing part-time hematology at Children's, and went into practice with Harry Shirkey in the corner of Erkenbrecher and Elland, which is the site of one of the parking garages of the hospital at the present time. Things I remember teacher-wise are Gene Leahy and Clark West, George Guest, in particular. In our student days, I think Katie Dodd was probably the most stimulating teacher that I've ever seen.
She was really unique.
She was an unusual woman.
Yeah, a really different person.
So that's pretty much where I stayed at Children's ever since, and was in practice till '63. Came back to run the Clinical Research Center in full-time in 1963, and stayed in the clinical research, and then became vice chairman of the department, chairman of the department, and then in 1983, Lonnie Wright, who was the president of the hospital, left, and the chairman of the board asked me if I wanted to find somebody to be my boss or to try this the job as president. So I tried it. Been doing that ever since, and stopped being chairman of the department about 3 years ago. So I did those 2 things at the same time, and presently I'm president of the Hospital of Children's.
How about you, Jim?
Well, my story is similar at the beginning to Bill's. I'm a Cincinnati person, and grew up here, went to high school, and started in college. I got a couple years in before I went into the service. Went into the Navy in 45, and I was in the V-12 program. And the war in Europe ended in 45, and they cut out the V-12 program. So I found myself in boot camp as a plain old sailor. And I chose, when we finished boot camp, I chose Hospital Corps School, which at that time was in Idaho, Farragut, Idaho, of all places, for a Navy base, a huge Navy base out there. Went through Corps School, and we were in training to, that we were being prepared to go to Japan for the invasion of Japan. There's a beautiful lake out there called Lake Coeur d'Alene, and we would practice landing on the beaches of Lake Coeur d'Alene. And as a corpsman in those days, what you did in invasions was you hit the beach with the Marines, and you ran around giving morphine to everybody who was wounded. You try to keep them from going into shock, because they died of shock. And so obviously you couldn't start IVs or anything, but you just ran around and gave morphine. And so we were out there practicing on those beaches, and I'll tell you, when that bomb dropped, there wasn't anybody questioning whether Harry made the right decision or not. He was right. And so, at any rate, I came back here and went to medical school, and married a wonderful girl, a high school sweetheart, Rosemary, and we had a large family. Had some wonderful residency days with some wonderful people, and lots of very good memories. I decided on going into pediatrics. I was going to be an ophthalmologist. That was when I came back from Farragut, Idaho. I went to Great Lakes and worked in the eye clinic there. And they were discharging all the doctors, and the war was over. They're discharging doctors, and they still had all these patients up there. And I was doing things. I was 19 years old, and I was refracting eyes for part of the days. I was removing chalasia and pterygiums. I was treating corneal ulcers with acetic acid. It was unbelievable, the things that, you know. And anyway, I was hot on ophthalmology, and I was going that direction. I took my my first rotation as an intern was at the Drake Hospital, the old chronic disease hospital. And all they had out there, of course, were chronic diseases. And they had those out wards that they called the sawdust beds. Mm-hmm. And they had hundreds of derelict people out there who just didn't have homes, and they slept in these boxes filled with sawdust with a sheet over it, and the sawdust, of course, supposedly kept them from getting bed sores and all. Well, my job every morning was to go out and sign the death certificates of the 4 or 5 or 6 who had died during the night. I spent a month doing that. And my second rotation was pediatrics. And I came out of this dungeon into an area where you had really sick people, but you could make them well. And it was the thing that really appealed to me, I think, more than anything else. And I just decided at that point that I wanted to go into pediatrics. And so, and the rest, as they say, is history. I think it might be interesting to talk about what the physical plant looked like at children. It's certainly different than now. Bill has built it into I guess it's the largest in the country, Bill, isn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. It's
Pretty much,
pretty
yeah.
close anyway, yeah.
At that time, we had just the tower, or not the tower,
Tower.
what is now called C, or the main part of the old hospital.
In the main part of the old hospital, and it was in a double Y configuration. There was Y at each end, and then it was connected by a straight piece in the middle, where the doctor's parking lot, the MRI lot, is now. Used to be a beautiful green sloping lawn that went down toward Holmes Hospital. Out in front of the hospital were there's a big white square now facing Bethesda Avenue. That used to be a circle with a turnaround. As I remember it, that was where the visitors, it was big enough for about 25 or 30 cars, I guess. All of the visitors and all of the patients' visitors, and all of the visiting doctors parked there. And since parking's been one of my biggest problems throughout my life, in back of the hospital, between the Research Foundation building, which was there when we started there, it was a narrow building that stretched back from Elland Avenue toward Holmes Hospital also. There was a narrow, there was a space in there, again, that was big enough for about 25 or 30 cars. And that's where the faculty parked. And not many of us had cars, I don't think, but I guess we parked there too, didn't we?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
right. It was just not a large
There
area.
weren't many of
but
us there anyway.
We managed to squeeze in. Yeah, it was Children's was the place to gather at lunchtime during our days. We had Mrs. Ilvisacker. Do you,
Oh, yeah.
you remember Ilvi?
Marvelous food at Children's in those days.
Oh yeah. Everybody wound up at Children's at noon to have lunch. We all ate together. It was sort of an interesting evolution. As I remember it, when I first started coming there, you would come in and sit down, and someone would bring you the food, and there would be little things on the table to nibble on while you were waiting. And then pretty soon we found ourselves standing in line going through the cafeteria. But they always had the doctors walk ahead of everyone. You would always come right in and go to the head of the line. And then all of a sudden you were at the back of the line, which stretched all the way down the hallway. And then the next thing was you started paying for your meals. So it really evolved in a negative fashion, but...
Well, a year or so before that, the doctor's dining room was even more posh. There was a little box hanging on the wall over there with a bunch of little cubby holes. Each cubby hole had someone's name, and you kept your napkin in there. And when you came in to eat, then you'd go over and you'd get your napkin out, and you'd use it, and when you were through, you'd fold it up and put it back in the hole. And Mrs. Silversacker, I guess, every 2 or 3 days, took them all out and washed them.
Well, the pies that the homemade pies that we had.
Weren't those delicious?
Marvelous. They were just out of this world. It was a great way to meet, to interact with people, because I mean, you would be eating with Merlin Cooper or Joe Warkany or Sabin. I don't know whether Sabin ever left the lab to come down to eat.
Once in a while.
Once in a while, yeah. He was not quite as gregarious as some of the others. One of the things I remember about Albert Sabin was the fact that his own dog bit him, and he came into the emergency room for a tetanus shot when I was in residents have kind of a bizarre memory. But it was a way of having a good interaction with the academic staff and the teachers. It's too bad it doesn't lend itself to that anymore, but we'd have to have the ballroom at the Netherland, I guess, to accommodate the...
I think that's part of the issue, Jim, that at that time, there were probably about 10 faculty and 20 residents, roughly, maybe plus minus,
Yeah.
so I think about it, full-time faculty. And so they could all fit into that room.
Right.
Now, there's 190 full-time faculty, one kind or another, and there's a couple hundred, there's 90 pediatric residents, and there's really, adding on some of the other pediatric PM&R and pediatric psychiatry and all, there probably, at any given time on the resident staff, there's probably 110 people. So if you add all those together,
It's
you have
impossible.
390 people to put into
Yeah,
a single room.
just doesn't work.
Barely fit into
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
made the dining room as it is. In fact, a lot of them meet in their labs now. Not in their labs, but in spaces outside their labs.
We also had the contage unit
Yes.
to attend. There were 19 of us. I think our year,
Yeah,
there were 19 of us total.
that was an increase from the preceding year, I think.
Yeah, and so we had the main hospital, and we had the contage, which had maybe, depending upon the season, whether it was polio or not, we had, maybe 4 wards of 25 or 30 beds each over there. And then what else? We had 8.
H Pavilion.
H
was-
Pavilion.
Probably had about 60 beds and probably ran about 40 kids, something like that.
Yeah,
And
then,
the nursery that was
That's right,
delivering 4,000 or 5,000 babies a year,
right. And then Convalescent Hospital.
right?
And we had 1 or 2 residents used to go to Convalescent Hospital too, as I remember, or maybe we were on call for Convalescent Hospital, but there was some connection. And when you think back, with 19 of us covering...
The baby's milk fund clinics downtown.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
right. That's
And,
right. Going down there. During the polio season, we must have had, it must have been a bad year during maybe 53 or 54, because I have the vivid memories of these wards full of the old iron lungs, and we used to sleep in what was, I think, formerly the smallpox wards, those old wards where the bats were flying around. They had a tennis
Well,
racket.
each room went outdoors onto the
Right,
covered veranda, sort of.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. But you used to hit the bats with a tennis racket to knock them down. But every once in a while, during a storm, the power would go out, and
Yeah.
that alarm would go off, and everybody would run down to the respirators to pump them manually until...
Did we have a pole that we slid down there?
I don't think we had a pole,
No.
but
No?
we should have had a pole.
I've told people about the pole we slid down.
I don't, if there
well,
was, it was gone when we were there, I think.
the other thing I remember were the Sunday morning rounds.
Sunday morning rounds, and you remember Sunday, which were great, Sunday lunches also.
Sunday lunch, yeah.
All the
but,
residents and their families and their wives
Yeah.
came to lunch. And
But
most of the
everybody-
faculty weren't there on Sunday, but
Yeah. None of us had any money, so that's
Right, it was a
where
meal.
we
Everybody had-
got to eat.
you got free meal tickets for your family too.
Yeah.
Do you remember
Yeah.
that? I can't remember how many you got,
Many as you wanted.
Well, you worked every other night, and I remember that, and then we came in on Sunday, and everybody came.
Started in radiology on the 4th floor with Fred Silverman,
Right, that's where you'd wind up rounds looking at x-rays of the week.
and then that was over. It went from 9 to 12, I guess.
Right.
And
We
you
had
met your
the
wife downstairs.
newborn unit was 2 centers, I remember.
through center, yeah, the infant ward.
Yeah, that was a total...
So-called clean on one side and dirty on the other.
Right, yeah, but it was all pretty
It
dirty.
was all pretty dirty.
With all of us going back and forth all the time.
Yeah, but it was that era, wasn't it, when the gray baby business came along with chloromycetin? Wasn't it
I think
a
it
little
was
after
a little
that?
bit later. I think two-setter was still in operation, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Bill?
yeah. But I think
Yeah,
But it
I
was-
remember
that was-
Jim's,
That was 56, 57, something like
it
that.
happened in 2 Center that you
Yeah.
you made the
This is-
discovery.
I think we were having an epidemic of E. coli in the city, and these kids would come in shock, and the ones who weren't in shock, we pretty soon put them in shock with chloromycetin. If they didn't get better, we gave them more. So, but I think, well, I don't think, I know it was Jim who finally put the key on that thing to open that door.
Well, I think there were 2 patients over at the General Hospital, babies, who, because they had infection or were thought to have infection, were treated with chloramphenicol. And whoever the resident was chose a dose which was double the dose that had usually been used. In retrospect, we went back, and that was in the recommended range. We had been using somewhere a lower part of the recommended range as a routine, but this resident chose to give this baby a double dose, still a recommended dose. And both babies died with the same syndrome within about 24, 36 hours. And that was the key. There's something going on here. And we started looking into it. And it was supported in the literature by other patients, mainly adults who'd gotten huge doses of chloro and done exactly the same thing. Then Bill heard about this and came along with the patient that he'd seen in one of the other hospitals that had I think they got teaspoons of chloro rather than cc's, so they got 5 times the dose that had been ordered, and that baby had the same thing. So there were 3 of those babies that we recognized.
It wasn't all grim hard work, though. We had a lot of fun. You ever play the ukulele anymore, Jim?
Never played the ukulele. What was that episode in the? Weren't you doing an exchange transfusion?
Oh, I wasn't doing it. If you remember, you and I used to play the ukulele.
Right.
And Hal Marsden hated it. And so whenever we would start playing, he'd turn up the radio so loud you couldn't hear anything. And he was doing an exchange transfusion up in the operating room, and he was trapped. And the 2 of us went up there and played him.
We scrubbed up, put our masks
scrubbed up, put the
gowns.
Playing our ukulele. I don't know if we did a hula, but it wouldn't have been totally out of character.
Somebody took a picture of that, which
Yeah, I don't know.
I've seen in the last 20 years.
Frank Schley arrived with a monkey. Do you remember Sassafras?
He came and he reported to me when he arrived, and he wouldn't let me go out to his car with him. I was going to go with him to his car and help him unload. No. He didn't want me to go to his car.
Well, he was my roommate, and he had that monkey in there. And I don't know whether you know anything about the toileting habits of monkeys, but they don't have any idea about restricting themselves in any way. It lasted a couple of days, and that was it. The monkey went. But well, Bill asked me to talk a little bit about the early days of practice, and Jim, you didn't experience this, but Bill did also. And you know, I joined Bill hunting. There were two-man practice. We were one of the practices in groups were not common then. Bill, you and Sky Downey and Harry Shirky were together, but there weren't many groups. It was single practice people. Everybody had their own practice. And but Bill asked me to join him, and we had a little office in Pleasant Ridge. We had a waiting room and one examining room and a little kitchen for a lab, and then a fluoroscopy room. If you remember, fluoroscopy was the big thing. Everybody, in fact, Clyde Dummer, who was practicing in pediatrics also in Pleasant Ridge with Bill and I, he did not have a fluoroscope. Bill Hunting had bought a fluoroscope. And people would call and ask if you had a fluoroscope because that was part of every routine exam. You put the child under the fluoroscope and show them their lungs and their heart, radiate everything in sight. And, but at any rate, someone called Clyde once and asked him if he had a fluoroscope, and he said, well, no, but I have an otoscope. So they said, okay, I'll come. So, but we did, the two of us practiced in that small office. We alternated. I would see patients sometime in the morning, and he would see them in the afternoon, and then on other days it was reversed. We made house calls continually. No sick patients, no febrile patients came to the office, at least in our practice. You saw all sick children at home, and especially during the polio summers, you can imagine it was hysteria. Every child with a fever and a headache had polio until proven otherwise, and so we would run around and make house calls during a good part of the morning, wind up at Children's for lunch, and back to the office for house calls, or for office for a couple hours, and then go back out and make house calls again. Come home and eat dinner, and then go back out and make house calls. And in the middle of the night, a call from a patient with a child with an earache was a house call. You didn't talk about it or anything. You just said okay, and you got up, got your clothes on, went out, looked at the child. Yeah. The thing about house calls that sticks in my mind is bathrooms. I mean, the first thing you did when you come into a house was go in and wash your hands. The bathroom was always spotlessly clean, with a fresh towel, a fresh bar of soap. So when somebody would call you, you had a mental image of a bathroom, and then of course while you're examining the child, the dog is sniffing around in your bag, and it was not the greatest thing, but it gave you a real feel for your patients. You had a more intimate knowledge of it, and everyone expected that. The idea that you would come to take a sick child outside, that nobody would buy that. And they also wanted their doctor. I don't know how that functioned with your office, Bill, but they wanted you.
We had Sky Downing and Harry and I were really together, but Dr. Downing's home was in Lebanon, Ohio, about 30 miles north of here. And so he came in on he came in on Thursday afternoon. He stayed until Saturday noon, and he left. And he took care of his patients came to him, and then Harry's patients and Mike came to him, and I was guaranteed $500 a month if I would pick up at the slack, So everybody finishing residency always thinks, I'm going to be so busy like I was in residency, but they're scared to death to go and practice alone. So essentially we were alone together, and I would sit at the window looking for patients to come up the street,
And they would probably be your relatives if they came.
They were relatives or doctors. At that time we didn't charge doctors for their children. So I practiced that way with Harry. A couple years later, Harry made the decision to go down to Birmingham, Alabama, so I practiced with Dr. Downing. He was there about 2 or 3 days a week, and I was there the rest of the time. And Dr. Rittershofer was upstairs, but really we didn't cross-cover each other at all, even though we were in the same building.
You were practicing on your own.
And we made house calls. Horace Stewart was one of the pediatricians at Children's that was a little unusual. He didn't have an office, and he made house calls. He had a telephone at home, and he made house calls continuously. And if the child was sick, he'd just take off his shoes, and he, often in the summertime he was running around in shorts and a t-shirt, take off his shoes, lie down on the floor, and sleep all night in the child's room. There's one time that I remember about Horace, until now I think, but there was a trisomy 21 or a Mongol child that was admitted with a duodenal atresia to 2 North, 2 Center North. And Dr. Stewart made the decision that that child was not going to be operated on. And there wasn't any bioethics committee or any, it was sort of the Baby Doe case, only in 1954 or 5, I guess. And so we did what we were told as good residents, and we just didn't do anything. And periodically, in the middle of the night, we were there all night, usually up all night anyway. And we'd see Dr. Stewart coming in, sneaking in gym shoes, and starting an IV on that baby. That's one of the scenes at Children's that I'll never forget. And then there was the carrot doctor, Harry Kendall.
Harry Kendall. Yeah, all of his patients were carrot anemic.
Yeah. He ate carrots and squash, and any yellow food was the only thing that the baby was allowed to eat for the first year. So they all were yellow.
All the kids look like carrots.
Yes.
Yeah. I never slept at the patient's house, but I do recall making a house call late at night with a mother who called and had 3 sick children on her hands for the last 3 or 4 days. And her husband was out of town, and she was frantic, you know, and I said, well, I would stop by. And she said, I hate to ask you this, but there's a 7-Eleven shop down the street, and she said, we don't have any bread and we don't have any milk. And I can't get out of here with these kids. She said, would you possibly stop and bring me a loaf of bread and a quart of milk, which I did. That was another house call I recall. All the kids wore cowboy boots and cowboy guns in those days. They'd all come in, they all had this cowboy regalia on. And one of the little gimmicks that I used to do was I'd say, let me see your gun. And, you know, they'd take it out and give it to you, and I'd go, bang, never give another man your gun. And, you know, it was just something that sort of became something I did. And I made a house call once, and there was this little kid there with his holsters on. I said, let me see your gun. And I took it and squeezed the trigger, and it was one of those guns where you put a cap on the end of a little plastic bullet. And the thing went off, and it hit this kid in the chest. I almost died. Gee, that was the last time I did that. I never went back to that.
You know, Sky Downing made all kinds of house calls, and he had patients all over the tri-state area. So one of the first weekends he was away, one Saturday night, I saw patients all afternoon in the office. Then I got in the car to start on the house call rounds. And one of them was in Indian Hill. Well, I'd never been to Indian Hill in my life. So I had a map, and I got out to Indian Hill, and I ultimately found this great big house and went in and took care of that kid. Then I got back in the car, and the next one was across the river in near Devou Park. And I found my way up to there eventually, and there are 2 houses. If you cross the bridge, the I-75 bridge going south, if you look up, there are 2 houses that are almost twins. These houses are 1-floor plans, and we were living out in Groesbeck at that time, so I got over there and I went in, found the child, mother, and both the mother and the child had red hair, and I went in. The child had tonsillitis, and I guess I gave her a shot of penicillin or whatever. I think that's what we were using then. Mm-hmm. And turned around, and there was a woman to the mother, and a woman standing there, and I said, well, this is what you should do. And she said, well, I'm not the mother. And I looked again, and it was a woman that looked exactly like the mother. So I said, where is the mother? Mrs. So-and-so. And they came out, and they were identical twins, redheads, with dressed identically. And, you know, they were about 30 years old. So I got to looking at the house, had a beautiful view of the river, and I said, asked him who had built it, and I think Dick Glaser was the architect. And I said, must be expensive to get an architect, because I had a little $50 a month house out in Groesbeck, and we were just at that time thinking about where to move. she said, well, we had the plans drawn up, and then we just turned them over and built another house, a mirror image of it. And she took me in the kitchen, and she says, if I'm in the kitchen, my sister's in the kitchen across the way, we can look at each other. And she pushed a button, and we can talk and hear everything we say. So it was an I left that. I was amazed by that, and I went home and told my wife, and just about got settled in bed in Groesbeck. And the telephone rang, and it was the emergency room at Children's. One of the things they had at Children's at that time was no emergency room doctors, and a rule that and Alice Wilmick was the second shift nurse there, wonderful person that received the first Pediatric Society award, I think, years ago. That trained all of us in how to start do LPs and start IVs and things like that. She called me and she said, well, we have a private patient here, Bill, and she said residents aren't allowed to see them, and will you see the patient? So I started that routine. And I used to go back and forth from Groesbeck to the hospital 2 and 3 and 4 times a night on busy nights. I'd sew up lacerations, I'd do the LPs to make sure the kid had meningitis. Then I'd get the resident involved in taking care of the kid. The residents were allowed to see everybody else, but they weren't allowed to see the private patient.
That's right.
And so the resident would be standing there. I would be dragging myself out of bed and driving 8 or 10 miles to get there. And then, but that was the way I made my living.
Yeah, it was a lot different, I used to go to, I took care of the children at St. Aloysius Orphanage. Was one of the ways I made my living. They paid very little, but it was better than doing nothing in those days. And as you said, you used to sit around and wait for a patient to come in. But I had some experiences there that were just unbelievable. There were about 100 children at the orphanage then. They mostly weren't orphans. Their parents were either in jail or out at Dunham in the TB hospital or someplace, and they had to go. So that's what St. Al's did. There was a nun there, Sister DePazzi, a fabulous woman, just fabulous. And she ran the little dispensary there, and we had about a 4-bed ward where we kept sick kids. And I remember she called me one day toward the end of office hours and said, I think you better come back over here. She said, I've got a situation. I said, well, what's going on? She said, I just can't tell you. You got to come. And so I went over and I walked in this little room, and there's this boy, maybe about 8 or 9 years old, lying face down on his head on an examining table. And protruding from his rectum is a skate key. You remember the old-fashioned skate keys, how they, like this? Well, he apparently had inserted this into his rectum, and when he tried to pull it out, it caught the mucous membrane. And it had been there for about 4 or 5 days, and he finally couldn't stand it anymore. Came to the nun and told her. And so at that time, St. Al's had very little money, and you did all kind of things yourself. And so I looked at this thing and I thought, well, if I can spread where that's folded around, if I can spread that open and then push it back up, I get that thing out of there. So I said to Sister, can you get me a screwdriver and a pair of pliers? And she looked at me a little bit suspiciously, but she did come through. And I got a hold of the thing with the pliers and got the screwdriver in there and wedged that thing up and got it in, got it out, and I dropped it in a little pan that she had there. And when it hit the pan, this kid turned around. He said, "Is it out? Is it out?" I said, "Yeah, it's out." He turned around and grabbed my hand, started kissing my hand. He was the most grateful patient I've ever had in my life. I'll never forget that child. So I said to him, "No, I don't know how that skate key got in there," but I said, "We've had some high winds lately." And I said, I doubt that it's going to ever happen again. He said, "Oh, no." Private practice was a lot different. I told Dr. Weech once it took me about 2 years to forget enough to be a good practitioner. I was thinking in terms of academic stuff, but just trying to be able to instruct mothers on feeding Everybody made their own formulas in those days. You didn't have, it was evaporated milk, water, and Caro. And that was, so you maneuver that around. But nobody told us anything about that in our residency training. Or, when do you start carrots if you weren't Harry Kendall? All those little mundane things that you had to pick up one way or another. But
Oh yeah, the other thing was different. There was no newborn intensive care units at Children's. There was a premature unit on H1 at the university, and what newborn intensive care there was on the clean side in 2 Center, we went. At least I went to all these premature units. We went to all the deliveries, first of all. And we went to all the premature units, and there was a nurse in each unit. Very seldom did you send anybody over to Children's because there wasn't anything to do over there. And so basically the babies either lived or died depending on the nursing care they got there. And then the newborn intensive care unit was open, the first one was open when, Jim? On one east.
Middle 1960s, would you
Yeah,
say? Something
yeah.
like that. And actually, we gotten started with that, I think, over at the General Hospital when we started transporting some of the infants of diabetic mothers, some of Harvey Knowles' juvenile diabetics who were pregnant, and we started moving them over. And that was, I remember once I was driving a Renault, and I had the baby in the little Prego carrier, the little lunchbox with the hot water bottles and an oxygen tank, and I ran out of gas. Down on the corner, down there where that apartment building is, beyond the medical science, medical arts building. Mm-hmm. So I carried this thing and I ran with that baby. I left my car parked down there and I ran with that up to H1, which was diagonal. It must have been about 3 blocks. I was absolutely exhausted when I got up there. But that was, there weren't a lot of those babies that were transported at that time. It was probably one every few months.
Yeah.
I wonder how different being a chief resident is now than when you were chief resident.
It was fun, and I learned a lot back in the old days. I think as chief resident, there were, as always with a group of people, there were some people that weren't as strong as other people. You tried to prop them up. There were people that couldn't get along with other people, and it was a continual manipulating of people to try and get the right combination in the right place and not let anybody know what you were doing. There were a lot of severe illnesses during that period. And I remember Mary Harmon and Joanne Whitaker were out of operation for 6 months. You were out for a while. Bill was out for a while, and then there was all the manipulation to try and double up and cover, because I think we had 19 people, as you said at that point, 17, 19, something like that. Yeah. So one person missing made a big difference.
A lot of TB at that time, remember?
Yeah.
Did you have a secretary as
resident?
As a chief resident? How many?
Yeah, they got three chiefs and two secretaries.
2 secretaries. Well, I think the administration office, or the total administration, as I recall it, was 2 or 3 secretaries down there, and it was either Ed Hyde or Bob
Southwick.
I think the schedules, Virginia Pierce or Gene Pinder or somebody up there would do those. These schedules, we went through several drafts, and they did a lot of that.
Yeah.
But that was about the only,
Another thing about the hospital was different was the air conditioning. You walked in the front door faced on Bethesda, and you drove into this really pretty circle, and you walked up the steps, and the entrance, it's on Ellen Avenue now, and so as you go in the atrium with the stone carving above it was there in the front of the hospital, and you walk through there, and you turn to the right, and that was the administrator's office. That was air conditioned. And then you went upstairs one flight, and the reasons were beyond me. The center was air conditioned, and then the babies that were in there, a lot of them were in incubators, and were trying to get their temperature up with the incubators, and the temperature in those two units those were air conditioned, and I guess the operating rooms were, but otherwise, there were screens on the windows, and the high ceilings and all didn't make it seem as hot as it is now.
Well, I think we've all gotten spoiled now. You know, you just can't live without it. But no, it was a different time. There wasn't a whole lot of difference between the chief resident, or at least between the second-year resident and the first-year resident. As I remember, we were all doing more or less the same thing. Maybe they had a little more supervision, but
Well, I think there was usually a second year that was supervising two or three junior residents. So they're
first years.
But also doing the work, working side by side,
Yeah.
working side by side, but also there to offer his experience 1 year.
Such as it was.
Such as it was. Yeah. It's amazing things.
Yeah. Well, I think we've run out our hour on the stage, so to speak, and.
Let's you delve at a story of getting caught outside one night.
Oh, no, let's not do that one today. That's a.
Any comments
But-
on Tom Conway or Al's opponent or any of those?
Oh, there were a lot of great guys that went through. Al DeGarmo, a lot of them are no longer with us. Yeah. Tom Conway was part of our group, and John Andrea. Those fellows went out and did practice in a smaller town, Terre Haute for Tom, and Canton, Ohio for John Andrea. Golly, who were some of the other?
Frank Sly, you mentioned.
Yeah, he wound up
He's
down south.
And he was the wildest guy we knew, and there was the straightest woman from New England, Mary Wheatland, that I thought that she was a wonderful person, a wonderful pediatrician, but the two eventually married, and they've had several children. They live down in Georgia now, and most unlikely couple I'd ever expect to get married.
Yeah, that's right.
And then Mary Harmon and
Joanne
Whitaker. And Joanne Mertz is up in, she's still up in Terre Haute.
Is
now.
she still practicing?
Petoskey.
Petoskey, up in Michigan.
And Tom is in Terre Haute, he's practicing half-time. Was Zapersky with us or not? Or was that-
Zapersky came, I think, a couple years after we did. He and Al Mauer, I think, were there at about the same time.
He came after I left when I was in Boston, I think.
And Gadacek preceded us, did he not?
Yeah.
Preceded all of us.
Yeah.
The stories abounded, but
I guess the memory lingers on. Well, it was there was a television program back in the 50s, Edward R. Murrow. You remember Edward R. Murrow with a cigarette smoke playing up in the black and white television, and the program was called You Are There, and he would relive a day in history, and the wind-up was it was a day like all days, filled with the events that alter and illuminate our times, and you are there.
So you have been there.
We were there. I guess we illuminated our times to some degree, but they were good times, and I was privileged to share them with both of you, and also to retain your friendships over the years.
great.
So I think we'll say goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.